Alrighty, sorry about the delay. Welcome back to another thrilling installment of Wordy Wednesdays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Fregath, and today we're doing the second half of Termush by Sven Holm. So we have since been introduced to the world of Termush. It is a hotel. The titular location is a hotel for people, wealthy, well-to-do people, who wanted to survive the apocalypse in style and comfort. And so this they have done. World War III has broken out, and mutually assured destruction did indeed happen. And so now they get to survive in a pleasant hotel, while the rest of the just about all the rest of the world outside is a radioactive hellhole. So good times all around, really. The psychological effects are starting to be felt. We're going to have a bit more of that in the second half, and as well as the resolution/conclusion. So yeah, hopefully people enjoy. Oh, thank you for tuning in, Kiri. Hope you enjoy as well. I don't think we ever get the name of our perspective character. Character. If we did, it's way at the beginning, and I'm not going to flip through to find it. Depending on how long it takes me to get through to the end, I may or may not read the foreword by Jeff Vandermeer. I skipped it because I kind of wanted people to get the raw and unvarnished of the book, because I rather enjoyed it, and I kind of wish I hadn't read the foreword ahead of time either, because it spoils a lot. Some of the language used is really, really brilliant in the book, and I want it to stand on its own merits. So yeah. Our perspective character has made nice friends with the Lady Maria. There's tensions rising due to differing ideas about what the guests should and should not know. All sorts of things. Kind of brewing up into a nice, glorious, baked good. A croissant, possibly. At any rate, I'm going to get some water in me, and we'll get cracking. Chapter 15. This morning, the management invited the guests out for a trip by boat. The air was calm, and there was no sign of a change in the weather. The boat was due to leave directly after breakfast. We were asked to go down the steps leading from the observation point to the beach. The security men had sluiced down and cleaned the rocks to cut away the nearest bushes, and cactus plants. I got up from the breakfast table and went into the sick bay to have a talk with the doctor. A number of nurses and security men were bustling about with instruments and bed linen. None of them could tell me where the doctor had gone. When I was standing in the front hall, he came down the stairs. "I have been busy," he said at once. "Are you in favor of the management's boat trip?" I asked, "or has it been arranged to silence the criticisms of the guests? There is no protection at sea, if there should be a depression in the atmosphere." "I am in favor of the management's boat trip," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "Believe me, I am wholeheartedly in favor of the management's boat trip." He stood there for a moment and laid his hand on my arm. I moved out of his way, and he went into the sick bay. I told Maria about my conversation. She slowly nodded her head. She thought the doctor's reaction was a guarantee that the trip was not dangerous. I agreed to keep calm, as she put it, and go with her to the boat. Just before we left, one of the security men went round the corridors calling to the remaining guests. I asked whether there were many who were staying in their rooms. He said that everyone who was not on the sick list ought to go on the boat. You said that as if it was not a voluntary activity, I said. Of course it is voluntary, he replied. The grounds were bathed in sunlight. Our limbs are already out of practice at moving over large surfaces. It was difficult to follow the path across the grass, not because I walk uncertainly, but because our eyes have become accustomed to meeting walls, steps, landings, and doors everywhere, and the open, unfamiliar spaces affect our vision as if they were precipices. The cactus plants stood like monuments made of interlocking glass. The trees and bushes were further away than ever at the edge of the lawns. Only the rock formations towered up as before, stripped of all vegetation, but having a recognizable shape. The first time we went down to the observation platform, I offered Maria my arm. Now I had to look for support from her because of a slight dizziness. I did not mention that I felt unwell because I did not want to cause her anxiety or to emphasize the feeling myself. Through my right arm I was aware of her calm balance, and I did not need to strain my eyes to follow the twists of the path. At the far ends of the grounds, below the platform, stood the hotel's collection of statues. Flights of steps and small paths led us among them. The way had been purposely designed to take the hotel's guests past each individual statue. The management had described the collection of statues in the brochure as its most prized possession. But not until a few days ago had the figures and their surroundings been cleansed by the security men. This was announced over the loudspeaker system with considerable enthusiasm. If by impressive one means exaggerated, these figures were impressive. Gigantic lions and tigers in stone, lying with their limbs curled under to follow the shape of the stone. They were curious forms, the bodies like great ill-defined blocks, designed more to evoke a sense of weight and mass than to suggest power in the muscles and sinews. The animals had their heads raised and stared out over the sea or in towards the hotel with great arched eyes. In the ploughed up and trampled gardens these stone creatures are the sole survivors. The security man who followed us walked slowly so that we should have time to become engrossed in them. He himself stood a little to one side, as if he were afraid of stealing the picture from the animals. The trip by motor yacht lasted 3 hours. We sat close together in 2 small saloons or on the sun deck. Each new movement, setting out the chairs, serving chilled white wine, was remarked on by the guests. The sensation of being at sea we felt only in the long swells that made the boat rise and fall. The tight rows of people made it impossible for the surface of the sea to seem other than an illustration, a proof that we were taking a trip by boat. Even though it was the first time we had been anywhere outside Termush, we sat silent, sunk in our own thoughts. We all felt the similarity between the boat trip and a stay in the shelters. The management's invitation, the serving of white wine, none of this could shake us out of our numbness. We sat opposite each other, beside each other, on top of each other, and each tried to avoid catching anyone's eye or reacting to anyone's movements. We retreated into ourselves, let ourselves be protected by our silence and the clothes we were wearing. Throughout the entire voyage the high, mountainous coastline lay within our field of vision. For a long time Termush gleamed white among its parkland, but it faded as the sun rose in the sky. We went past a rocky island that stood up from the surface of the sea like a dark, square block. Suddenly the air became cold, though afterwards I did not know whether this was due to the broad shadow of the rock or to a feeling within me at the sight of the island. I was standing on deck, but I came below when the boat turned round to sail back to the coast. One of the children, who had been sitting still and had not shown the slightest interest in going above from the saloon, began to cry on the way back. He cried quietly, but with a steady sobbing and his hands in front of his face. He lay with his head in his mother's lap, and she laid a hand on his back, but did not move him. When the boat had gone alongside, we came slowly off to land. No one had been keen to arrive for lunch in the hotel. We went past the stone figures, the observation platform, and through the grounds to the main shops. I did not want to lean on Maria, but I kept close to her, and from time to time I touched her hand. When I sat in my room after lunch, I was seized by a violent pain in my heart. I did not know whether this was due to the effort of walking along the beach or to anxiety about what is happening at Termush. It is impossible to define the situation. My own desire to distinguish between friends and enemies perhaps prevents me from seeing clearly. I stayed in my room for the afternoon, and again in the evening. Maria comes and goes, almost without my noticing it. Chapter 16. While we were away from Termush yesterday, more than 20 injured people arrived at the hotel. The management had worked out a plan and just waited for a day when the weather made it possible for the guests to stay outside the building. At a meeting in the lounge, the management explained the circumstances. They had, out of consideration for the guests, spared them the sight of the injured and the maimed. They had done everything to ensure that there was no encroachment of the freedom of the guests or their rightful possessions. It had been necessary to turn the library into a place for the strangers to stay, but shelves with books and magazines would be put up in the lounge in the course of a few days. They had laid claim to a minimal amount of space in the shelters. It simply meant that when the alarm sounded, children and their mothers would be allowed to stay in the women's section, where the previous day the places had not been fully occupied. The management concluded by reminding us that the strangers' meals were always prepared from food that did not belong to the guests. There was a benumbed silence in the lounge after this speech. Neither the chairman nor his closest followers showed any sign of commenting on what had been said. As a demonstration of his importance, or a token of his impotence, the chairman rose to his feet and left the meeting. The management emphasized that no more injured people would be admitted to Termush. All concerned had stretched their resources to the limit. The management thanked the guests for their understanding. I began to be able to read the guests' slowly formed opinions, not as clearly defined points of view, but as vague impulses or ephemeral convictions. They were reassured, but anxious. They did not know whether to incline towards confidence or distrust. They got up and went out of the lounge without saying much. I felt personally an enormous relief, a mute sense of elation. My most worrying suspicions and ideas melted away. But at the same time I had a stirring of anxiety about the situation. I did not dare to put my confidence either in the management's determination or the guests' perceptiveness. The doctor was standing rocking on his heels when I found him in the hall, by the steps down to the shelters. I saw from his expression that his was a cheerful, nervous excitement. I'm sorry. I think I could have read that better. I saw from his expression that his was a cheerful, nervous excitement. I stopped with my back to the wall within earshot of him. I did not ask him any questions or invite him to speak.
The deputy medical officer and I threatened to resign if the injured were forbidden access to Termush,
He said a little later.
The management made us promise that these were the last ones we would receive. In return, the hotel would stand solidly behind us in dealing with the guests. Those were the conditions we were obliged to accept.
The management is scared, I said.
They are scared lest the guests should take legal action against them, he replied.
In what court? I asked. The doctor gave me a rapid glance.
The management is also scared of losing its chance of survival, he said. Each injured person represents a threat to that chance.
But you, doctor, I asked, what do you want to do about the injured?
The sick are my stock in trade, he said calmly.
I walked alone in the grounds just before the sun went down. The garden was accessible because the weather was set fair. On my way to the observation platform, I saw Maria coming towards me. She laughed as if she had not expected to see me, and stretched out her open, upturned hand towards me when I was still a little distance from her. In the palm of her hand was a dark object. She stopped still, holding her open hand motionless, and waited for me. Suddenly a man in shining uniform emerged from the bushes behind her and ran silently up the path. She did not catch sight of him, for he pushed into her so violently that she half fell onto the flagstones of the path. I was starting to run down to them when I realized that the stranger was one of the security men. He had already taken off his gloves and stood bending over her to help her to her feet. "You must not touch them," said the security man. "What was it you were holding in your hand?" I asked. "A bird, a dead bird," she answered. "It is forbidden to touch them," said the security man. "They are certain to be infected. You must go into the sick bay and be examined." I wanted to help Maria and go up to the hotel, but I caught sight of the bird, which had been thrown into the rough grass at the side of the path. It was brown and quite small. I turned to the security man, who was just drawing on his gloves. "Are there many of them?" I asked. "Every morning," he said. At least there are most in the morning." Before we reached the hotel, Maria collapsed into my arms. I realized that the man's sudden assault had released her fear. In the sick bay, her hands were disinfected and her clothes were examined. The assistant doctor was careful and silent and gave her 2 sedative tablets. As we went into the hall together, I heard the injured crying out from the library. The sound was naked and long drawn out. Perhaps that was due also to the fact that the room had been cleared of furniture and carpets to make room for the beds. Chapter 17. In the night, the hotel was roused from sleep. A continuous yelling, which sounded like somebody having a wild party, was interrupted by a thump on the stairs. I heard doors being opened and guests running out into the corridor as the cheerful bawling started up again. Later than both my neighbors, I recovered my balance and summoned up sufficient willpower to open the door. On the carpet in the corridor stood one of the guests, a man I had noticed earlier as a silent spectator with a tired smile. He was wearing pajamas and stood swaying his head as the residents crowded round him. Just as I came out of the door, he half collapsed, laughing and babbling, while several arms saved him from falling over onto the carpet. It was only then that I caught sight of the carved-up carcass of a calf that he had dragged behind him up the stairs. He tried several times to get near the animal, but the guests prevented him from touching it, as if that in itself was a danger. They stared doggedly at the stairs, where the assistant doctor appeared shortly afterwards. The helpful guests let go of the man too soon, and he got to the calf before the doctor. 4 arms had hold of him as he wept loudly, tossing his head. The doctor prepared to give him a sedative injection. When the patient had been helped down the stairs to the sick bay, the guests disappeared into their rooms. The calf was left lying there. I saw it clearly in the circle of light under one of the lamps. The legs stood out from the headless body. The belly was slit open, and the hide was half ripped off. The colors were blurred, as in a dummy of painted wood and leather. Although I knew that the animal had come out of the deep freeze, I tested to see if I could find traces of blood in the corridor or on the stairs. It was cold on the carpet where the carcass had lain. The man had run amuck in the kitchen, where he had found some bottles of wine and had drunk or smashed half a dozen. In the meat larder he had pulled the calf down from the hook. Nobody had seen what he was doing until he dragged the calf's carcass up the stairs and in his terrified state of drunkenness collapsed in the corridor. He remained lying in the sick bay. The management let it be known at breakfast that the damage was slight and that special locks had been placed on the doors of the kitchen. In answer to a question from a guest, the management said that no action would be taken against the man who had run amok. It was not the hotel's business to administer punishment, only to take precautions and offer reassurance. During the course of the afternoon there arose an inexplicable agitation among the guests. It had without doubt some connection with the destructive incident in the kitchen. Many felt that to be a bewildered and innocent Many felt that to be a bewildered and innocent attempt to break away from the set conventions, a kind of return to the rebellion of youth. But those who sympathized most with his behavior were also those who had the most confidence in the management's security arrangements. They felt excited by his exploit, but wanted at the same time to prevent it from happening. The agitation showed itself in the groups of people who kept breaking out of the hotel and wandering down through the grounds so far towards the boundaries that several times the security men had to intervene and stop them. The observation platform became filled with guests, who split up into small groups and went down the steps between the stone statues or down to the beach, where they let themselves be driven to and fro by a common curiosity as to what lies hidden between the 2 cliffs marking the edge of our territory. In the afternoon the alarm went off. Most of the guests were in the hotel. The weather had turned colder and the sky was overcast with cloud. I saw from the windows of the hall that the last ones ran up towards the building, bunched together, attacking the flagstones as if the very earth were preventing them from escaping at speed. We waited for the injured to be carried away from the library down to the shelter steps. Many turned away, affecting to be preoccupied, or in acknowledgment of fear of what they might see. I noticed that many of the strangers had facial injuries or had bandages on their arms or legs, but most of them simply lay there exhausted, the pupils of their eyes abnormally large in their emaciated faces. None of them complained or cried out while they were being moved. I could not decide whether this was due to something soothing in the way the beds were moved or to a collective consideration for the guests. We were installed in the shelters, each in our section and in our place. We sank into our familiar passivity with no sign of reaction or emotion. But I had to ask myself whether the alarm had been essential this time, or whether it had been ordered by the management as a form of therapy to reduce tension. Early in the evening the all clear was sounded. I went up to my room without having the energy to contact Maria or to listen to the music from the hotel's loudspeaker. But I lay restless for a long time before I fell asleep. Chapter 18. I tried to prolong my sleep in the morning to make up for a wretched night. I avoided going down to breakfast and kept the curtains at my windows tightly closed. But I remained in a state between sleeping and waking, a stage in which there drifted through my mind half sentences, sounds from my neighboring rooms, and visual impressions, though my eyes were shut. At a moment when I was deeply, not superficially asleep, Maria came in. She managed to pull back the curtains and sit down on my bed before I woke up. I saw from her nervous, shining eyes and her unruly hair that she was deeply agitated. I sat half up in bed, confused by her expression and my own slight feeling of guilt at having slept so long. I waited for new stories about the management or the chairman. To clear my brain, I fixed my attention on a distant point outside the window, the top of one of the large trees. But Maria waited until I looked her in the face. It was nothing to do with the management or the chairman. It was to do with herself. During the night her brain had tried to shut out thoughts of radiation. Whichever way she turned, she saw the picture, the weak gray light which streamed down from the sky, out of the walls and up from the earth and the floor. A faint radiance lay over the landscape, the outlines of the trees, the contours of the mountains, the beach, the stone statues. All of this was, as it were, veiled in a watery sheen that seemed to repeat and exaggerate the original shapes. And she saw the hotel residents wandering about in the landscape as if they were part of an old-fashioned painting. The distance between the figures was great. They were all a long way away, and had their backs turned towards the observer. They were dressed in bizarre clothes, as if to emphasize the tragic in their existence. The trees and mountains had enclosed these beings like polyps, but at the same time they themselves had become organic creatures, covered in fur or skin. That light streamed out of every object. It shone through robes and skin and the flesh on the bones, the leaves on the trees and the moss on the mountains. It seemed suddenly to reveal the innermost vulnerable marrow of people and plants, the sensitive growth tissue, the chalk, the iron, the blood. She was aware of this as if the radiation were visible to her alone, as if she, because of some defect, were the only person to have an impression of universal contamination. She had thought about my waning confidence in the management, and she saw for herself how every single day the hotel guests were exposed to this invisible radiation, while the management neglected to call them down to the shelters for fear of spreading panic. That morning, just before she got up, she was seized by a powerful dread. I made no reply to her when she had finished speaking. I had no power to corroborate her story or to deny it. I could dismiss her fantasies about the management deceiving the guests, but I could not contradict the ideas from which the fantasies had arisen. They contained an insight that could only be captured in a slow, shocked picture. We went down into the gardens, and I took her arm without asking her whether she needed my support. I wanted to take her mind away from the bewildering vision. I got involved in talking about Termush in the past, a past which covered the place like a tight mask, confining its inhabitants. When one thought about it, it was like setting the dark, old-fashioned paintings in motion. Royal carriages or noblemen's coaches driving over the gravel to the main steps. Servants gently bowing from the waist, standing at the door, or darting past the carriage wheels with incredible agility. Women with great billowing skirts and pleasant, nervous smiles. Men in dark costumes standing out like knife blades. Everywhere the hands of servants in protective white gloves, scores of hands among the baggage, in the doorway, and later lifting the coats from the guests' shoulders. Sorry about that.
coats off the shoes. Yes, there we go.
Horses steaming with sweat and urine, the coachman and the groom waiting to take them away. But there is still a figure inside the carriage, where the sun illuminates a square of plush and colored tassels. The management of the hotel receives the company, waiting at the side of the steps like a row of cypresses. The guests nod absent-mindedly, and the black figures bend for a moment at the waist. A flock of screaming swallows swoops into the yard. But there is still one figure remaining in the carriage. The door is half open, showing the plush and colored tassels. One of the servants is there and does not move from his place. The slender, large-eyed guests, smelling of perfume, have disappeared into the building. The sun shines down on the courtyard. Suddenly, a stout, brownish woman comes waddling out of a carriage right down by the stables. She walks badly and nearly twists her shoes over in the gravel. When she reaches the royal carriage, she flings open the door, and at once the flunkey lays a white hand on it. She steps on to the floorboard and bends down, her fat behind blocking the doorway. The nurse takes the child out of the carriage. He is dressed in dark blue velvet, with a silk collar and small gleaming shoes. There is madness in his face, in the eyes devoid of eyelashes and the tongue protruding from the almost lipless mouth. Hair grows sparsely on his scalp, and his ears are two deformed flaps of gristle. The nurse disappears up the steps and in through the door, her hand clutching the child's wrist. The child does not make a sound, but stares about him with wandering eyes as he totters over the gravel and up the steps. Only then can the carriage drive across the yard and the servants return to the house, whose main door is already closed. Maria fell asleep when we came back. She had said nothing while I was speaking. She had turned pale, and there was no strength in her body when she lay down on my bed. While she slept, I walked around the passages and corridors to the steps and across the floor of the hall, and I saw everything more distinctly than before. Every single detail in the dark, carved wardrobes, the pew seats along the walls, the heavy clusters of decoration on the tables and chairs, the tapestry-like folds above the bookshelves. The building was empty of guests. No royal kinsmen or rich men's families with their household gods or other expensive eccentricities. The guests of my own time were all in their rooms, sleeping, or sitting at their tables, lost in thought. When I came back, I noticed that the mirror did not reflect my face in as fine a detail as I had marked my own observations of the hotel's interior. But Maria was awake, and I suddenly met her eyes in the mirror over my shoulder. Chapter 19. The doctor has given instructions for 12 people to be isolated in the shelters. The guests' dosimeters showed no danger, but the urine analysis this morning recorded a sharply rising precipitation of radioactive materials. The hotel's lists have been gone through to find the points of contact between the 12 guests. Where their rooms are situated, the people they preferred to walk with in the grounds or eat with in the dining room. The food is being checked. Suspicion centers on a bowl of fruit which was left standing in one of the washrooms before it was put on the table. The management read out the list containing the names of the 12 guests. Among the healthy ones, there arose a sense of Among the healthy ones, there arose a quite shameless curiosity. I noticed a woman just in front of me who kept her head erect, making no attempt to bend or turn round. When we got up from our chairs, I realized she was on the list. In the afternoon there was hectic activity. The chairman set his supporters to work. The 12 guests packed their suitcases and went down to the shelters, where one of the rooms had been specially prepared. They kept silent, as if by talking they might bring infection to the rest of us, or as if isolation was a judgment on them. We talk about the sick people with sympathy, but their illness has filled us with a peculiar excitement. It is as though we, who have not been sent down to the shelters, have been given the opposite diagnosis: fit, able to survive, uninfected. We have escaped. We have never felt more full of vitality since the disaster. Somewhere in the shelters underneath us, the sick section is housed, the amputated limb which guarantees the health of the rest of the body. After dinner, the chairman appealed to the management to formulate new emergency regulations. Unreserved generosity to strangers outside Termush had resulted in the infection of 12 guests. He got up noisily from the table, but was interrupted by the doctor, who stretched out his arm and shouted that this was a lie. Amid the disturbance that followed, the management fetched its 2 witnesses. A young couple walked through the dining room, past the rows of tables. She was pale, and her dark hair drifted across her cheeks. He walked behind her, his head bowed. One of the management staff explained that the young woman's attention had been distracted by her friend, a security man. He had come in from the area beyond the grounds and had put down his protective clothing in the washroom. The girl put down the bowl near his clothing, and the fruit became contaminated by the dangerous dust that had clung to the material. "A tragic misfortune," concluded the management. "We have tried to insure against it by strict regulations." The girl looked up for a moment and moved her lips as if she wanted to speak. But no sound came, and she turned sharply round and steadied herself against her friend, who led her out of the room. When they came past me, I noticed that it was the same security man who had forbidden Maria to touch the dead bird. Silence fell among the guests. No one moved. There was a sudden shout. "Reconnaissance men! Scouts! Where are the scouts?" The management reacted, apparently unprepared. 2 of the staff stood up at the same time and began to speak. But nobody was listening. The question had grown to an intense and powerful murmur. While the 2 men leaned towards each other or turned to face the guests, words were thrown backwards and forwards. Only when the chairman stood up and stretched out his arms over the assembled company was there quiet.
Let us hear the management's explanation,
He said, a sudden grin lighting up his face.
Our reconnaissance men have been sparing with information, said one of the men. We only know that they have left the disaster-stricken town and are following a new route.
The radio link has broken down several times, called out the other.
The radio link has not been working properly, the first man repeated in a lower voice. We regret these mistakes. We beg you to be patient.
They both remained standing there, irresolute. Then the chairman made the sign to show that the meeting was over. The guests got up immediately. They left the dining room, not one by one, but in a kind of panic. They pushed their way out of the doors and spread rapidly into the hall, across the steps, or into the garden. I heard more distinctly than ever before the moaning of the injured from the library. I went up to my room alone, confused by the violence of events. I was not able to foresee these incidents. I cannot place them in context. My imagination is numb. I have forced myself to change round the pictures, clean the wash basin, and examine the glossy surface of the furniture for dust, all to prove my ability to master my surroundings. I have been walking about preoccupied with vague premonitions and conjectures. I cannot visit the doctor or talk to Maria. I lie down on my bed. I have been writing for a long time against an almost unmanageable fatigue. Chapter 20. I woke up suddenly in the night. I could hear no sound round about me. I had lain for a long time without moving, as if the bedclothes were made of asphalt. I got up from my bed. The clock had stopped. I went out to the bathroom. The taps were not dripping, and the water in the lavatory was undisturbed. In my room I saw the expressionless face in the picture and the empty field where the poppies glowed like lamps. The mirror was as dull as if its silvering had slipped to the wrong side. The walls reflected the walls opposite, with the furniture in faint shadow. Outside the window the outline of the grounds was misted over. The trees and rock formations were obscured by the darkness. The tree trunks and bushes lay buried in the lawns. The cliffs were levelled off. I went out into the passage and stood on the blue carpet which swallowed up the stairs and concealed the length and perspective of the corridor. It was sealed in a stillness that was almost tangible. I went across the corridor and opened the door of Maria's room. She lay leaning back in bed. Her body jutted forward, and her head was pressed down in the space between the frame of the bed and the wall. Her eyes and mouth were half open, and her face was covered in sweat. The bedclothes were twisted round her, threaded through her hands. The light was switched on. I saw that the bed was empty. I woke up when it was light. Maria sat on a chair by my side. She was watching something outside the window. She did not turn her head, but I followed the little movement of the pupil of her eye. I thought to myself that she was looking at the clouds. When she saw that I was awake, she told me that breakfast was over. "Calcium tablets," I said. She said that she on her own had dragged me into my room during the night. She had gone out onto the stairs because she was feeling physically restless. When she came back, I was lying on the floor in front of the bed. I told her about her body on the mattress. I had seen her in the anguish of death. I had been aware of the little sores on her skin, the bleeding gums, the hair falling out, all the symptoms we knew. She did not look at me while I was speaking. The management has promised brandy after dinner to celebrate the anniversary of the hotel's foundation, she told me. That's better than using the alarm, I said. Brandy is exhausting too, but that sort of intoxication is less harmful. The management has to hold the balance between the different panaceas. "I don't think anything will happen today," she said. "Everybody is talking about the brandy." "Do you know why the reconnaissance men have stopped sending radio reports?" I said. "While they have been staying in the stricken towns, they have forgotten about the holiday guests at Termush. That is what the management is trying to disguise." "Unless they have come to some harm," she said, "and it's that which the management is trying to hide." "And it's that which the management is trying to hide." I got up from my bed to put on my clothes. Before she went, she touched my arm, saying, "Many of the sick are dead already. The doctor said that they are burying one or two of them each night." Brandy was served in the lounge after dinner. A wavering excitement spread among the small tables. People began to play cards or tell stories that made those standing near them shake with laughter. The empty bottles were replaced by new ones. The laughter became louder, and the pile of used glasses grew higher. Slowly the guests began to leave the lounge. They withdrew noisily into the hall and up the stairs to their rooms to sleep. I saw later that the management helped the servants to tidy up the lounge. They examined the damage caused by cigar burns on the furniture and smashed glass on the carpet. The groaning of the sick people in the library has died down, as if they too were issued with brandy, or have been asked not to disturb the festivities on the hotel's anniversary. Chapter 21. A single incident has given rise to both heated and cold-blooded reactions among the guests. The disappearance of the reconnaissance men, the isolation of some of the residents, the arrival of the sick people, all these facts admitted of more than one interpretation. The picture quickly faded. The course of events was not clearly marked, and one's grasp of the situation slackened. But this story was simple. A straightforward moral was drawn from it, and everyone was able to proceed with a rapid violence which showed no consideration for the victim, but may have relieved the feelings of his judges. Early this morning one of the male guests was taken down to the sick bay. He had been found in the bathroom being violently sick, having a sort of convulsion. The doctor diagnosed radiation sickness, but before the alarm was raised, the man himself explained his medical history. He was suffering from advanced cancer of the stomach. During his entire stay in Termush, he had been taking pain-killing injections, but he had still had the strength and the willpower to be part of the company. Everybody can remember that he ate only easily digestible dishes, and that his excuse was an ordinary chill on the stomach. Everyone can remember that his emaciated face was a constant source of speculation. The first vague impulse towards curiosity died. The inquisitive thoughts were replaced by a wholesale condemnation. A feeling of communal unity, never known before, sprang up among the residents at Termush. No one needed to be a chairman to gauge the opinions of other people. The feelings of the silent guests in our hotel hit me like an ice-cold ray. The man's crime consisted in allowing himself to be registered for Termush, even though he knew he was going to die. The management had refused a number of applicants. He had given false information in answer to one of the questions on the enrollment form. The condemnation was clear, even though it was not stated in so many words. It was possible to talk a verbal shorthand. People stood still, face to face, and exchanged views. There was no need to call a meeting in the lounge. Communication was going on in the rooms, between one corridor and another, and on the stairs. Termush had become a living town, with streets and alleyways, and a stake set up in the marketplace. The residents formed a united people. No one was going to intervene and destroy its moral code. This unity abolished the painful distance between individuals. Hatred and repudiation gave them the strength they needed. I met the doctor, but could get no answer from him. He leaned against the lintel of the door and shied away from the questions.
I don't understand what has happened, he said. The management thinks that all human reactions come under my department, but I can't hand out tranquilizers at the dinner table.
The anniversary is over, I said, and the boat trip was not a success, so I would suggest using the alarm. The doctor looked at me quickly. It may be possible to protect the sick man, I said.
He has not many days left, he replied. He is already very weak.
He turned round and went into the sick bay, and I went up the stairs to Maria's room. The boundaries of Termush have become more restricted. Nothing has happened, but the new unity and condemnation act like a protective shelter, built deeper down than the original one, with walls of lead and doors that can be bolted against all strangers. Chapter 22. By breakfast time the news came through that the sick man was dead. Those who were sitting nearest passed this on quickly like a greeting or an abbreviated code word. There was neither triumph nor vindictiveness in their tone, neither regret nor surprise. They told it calmly, as if it were an accepted point in a story. I saw several guests stop short at the table. One of those sitting there bowed his head towards the speaker, listened, and waited for a moment before spreading out his napkin. Maria had come down before I did. She sat a little way away, and did not raise her head when I came in. She did not follow the news about the man's death with her eyes. She ate very slowly. I found the white of the egg indigestible. I swallowed my calcium tablets and drank half my tea. It seemed to me that the guests were purposely staying longer in the dining room this morning. They sat hunched up in their places, talking quietly, as if after a long period of insecurity they had found peace. They had been justified by events. Outside the sun shone, and no wind stirred the branches of the trees. I was walking alone in the garden after lunch when the alarm went off. I had gone down among the stone statues immediately after the sun had disappeared from that low-lying place. From the gravel path I could follow the guests in the grounds, whether they walked towards the observation platform or came near the edge of the broad lawns. I saw them pass by, 2 by 2, or several together. I could not see them stepping on the flagstones, just the upper part of their bodies, moving from left to right, turning to each other and making gestures with their arms, their mouths open, talking things over. I could not hear exactly what they said, but the hotel had become filled with energy and gaiety, and the gardens were full of people strolling about together. There had been no need to call the guests down to the shelters. They were not rebellious or irritable. Behind their new-found energy lay a cruelty so indirect that they themselves were not aware of it. They had already forgotten the dead man, and simply took note that the game was over. Their malice was gentle, their cruelty tired and fortuitous. But the management was disturbed by the guests' new, unplanned activity. I saw 4 figures above me at the moment when the alarm went off. They all stopped still and looked up at the sky, whose light illuminated them while I stayed in shadow. But the sky was set fair and filled with light. There was no sign of rain or depression. They looked at each other, turned round, and moved slowly down onto the grass leading up to Termush. Behind me the sun glittered on the sea. There was no movement of waves towards the shore. I rested my hand on the great leg muscle of the stone lion. It was still warm from the sun. Then I went up the steps and across the lawn towards the house, slowly like the other guests. No one was in a hurry. Everyone was ready to draw back and let someone else go first through the door into the hall. The sick had already been taken down to the shelters. We had to go in single file along the passage to get past the big screens that had been put up in front of the beds. One of the patients was groaning, though I could tell from his voice that he was under morphia. He mumbled the same syllables over and over, without stopping, and I could not make them into a word. When we had locked the door to the shelter, we were no longer disturbed by the sick people. I saw that none of the guests expected our stay in the shelters to be long. They sat back, relaxed, looked at the ceiling or the details of the benches, or started to play cards. There were no signs of uneasiness or exhaustion. Being there did not alter their expressions or their attitudes to each other. Not even the shelters could take away the guests' new solidarity, their feeling of belonging to a community. As if the management realized this, or perhaps because they had been acting at odds with their own convictions, the all-clear was sounded after an hour. The games of cards stopped, and the place emptied. The guests went straight up to their rooms to change for dinner. Out of consideration for us, the screens were not removed, and the patients were not taken up to the hotel until we had all left the shelters.
Forgot which cover with a file name on the last cover I had available was. Chapter 23. I am writing down the dream I had last night. I was looking out over the sea, which lay bathed in a faint, chilly light. I was present, but had no shape, like the sun shining, but without substance. Like a sun shining, but without substance. The water was clear and translucent. Even though it was deep, I saw the rock formations on the bottom, the sharp boulders bare of seaweed, all stripped and rounded, as if they had been carved in marble or granite. Through the sea swam a shoal of large fish. They did not appear to be dolphins or sharks. They were fish of a kind I did not recognize. The shoal dived down towards the rocks, rose up as if moved by a common impulse, broke the surface with their shining backs, and let their big fins glide through the air, while their bodies stayed in the water. The distance between the 10 or 12 fish remained the same, even though they changed places the whole time, gliding adroitly in formation. Whether they were deep down or high up in the water, their bodies worked as smoothly and powerfully as if they were made of one single muscle. Suddenly the movement of the fishes stopped. The light paled and diffused over the surface of the water. The glitter and the shadows disappeared. At that same moment I was present in my own person. I was wearing a jacket I had in the hotel, and standing on the floor of an enormous room. When I looked up, I saw the fishes hanging above me in chains, and iron pillars that stretched down from the roof. They had kept the same formation as in the water a moment before. Above them lay the sky, like a great blue-painted monochrome plate. When I had grown used to the half-light in the room, I saw the big open sores in the bellies of the fish. Immediately after dinner, while we were sitting in the lounge and the last light was fading in the garden, a woman came running or half stumbling in through the door from the hall. One of the male guests sprang up and caught hold of her to save her from falling onto the table, where there were cups waiting to be filled. "The lavatory! The lavatory!" she said, unable to explain herself. There were 3 or 4 of us who went out to the small lavatory under the stairs in the hall. The door was half open, and the light was not switched on. But in the light of the hall lamp we could see a man who had hanged himself. He had placed the rope round the windpipe. Wow. He had placed the rope round. He had he had placed the rope round the wide pipe from the cistern, and let himself down from the lavatory seat. He had landed with his legs apart, and one of his trouser legs was darkly stained with urine. When we had cut him down, the doctor was called. The hall was cordoned off until the body had been taken away and the little cloakroom had been cleaned up. We all went back to the dining room, where the coffee was cold and tasted bitter on the tongue. A few of the guests, those who lived nearest to the dead man, were summoned by the management. I could not make out why the management should be interested in half explanations and bits of gossip. No one could contribute an explanation of the man's death. Had it happened because he was a guest at Termush, or was it the result of some inner decision? Was it at all possible to differentiate between the two? The evening was spent in this meaningless investigation, but it seemed that the guests gradually became reassured. The suicide case seemed very easy to grasp, while we treated it methodically. The disturbing questions disappeared, and we waited only for the answer and the explanation. I went with Maria outside the house. It was the first time we had been in the garden after dark. It was hard to follow the path in the faint light of the moon. She walked close behind me, warm and agitated by what had happened. The earth, now cool, smelt soft among the trees. From the sea an almost visible wind blew into the garden. In the main building of the hotel, lights shone on the ground floor. Higher up, individual rooms were lit up. None of the windows needed curtains. Termush had no neighbors. Neither now nor in the past had there been any need to fear embarrassment. The hotel's estate was large, and the countryside beyond was rocky and sparsely inhabited. No one wanted to settle down or let cattle graze in the country round about Termush. I walked with Maria in the garden in the dark, as if we were part of an old painting. Even my invitation to take a walk in the evening seemed like an old-fashioned cliché. My way of leading her by the arm, my manner of speech when I talk to her, are obsolete, as are my thoughts when I want to make a comprehensive criticism of Termush. I look around me and come to the same conclusions that visitors to Termush have always done. Even when I try to express my perceptions, I use the same language and start from the same fixed premises. I felt suddenly chilled and asked Maria to go back. It was easier to follow the path as we returned. The light from the hall and the lounge picked it out. I saw myself as an aged landowner who sees his house on fire and his servants struck down. The rebels are already on the stairs, and against them he has only his whip and his quotation from Corneille. I held Maria's arm when we suddenly heard 3 pistol shots. They came from the edge of the grounds, inland, near the place where the drive disappears behind a rocky promontory. We stopped still at the same moment. "It's the security men who are shooting," she said. I nodded, but said nothing, and we went inside. Since a few of the guests who were standing in the hall showed no reaction, I judged that the noise of the pistol shots had not penetrated the hotel. Chapter 24. It was quite impossible to rest during the night. Periods of lively wakefulness alternated with a dark, exhausting stupor. Morning found me sitting on my bed, my skin tense and fever in my blood. In the dark I reversed the order of the room when I wanted to open the window. I put my fingers on the hinges of the door without recognizing what they were. I did not want to give way to panic, and I convinced myself that I had let my hand slip under the window frame. I felt the wall again and waited to touch the cold glass or the curtains. Suddenly the table hit me hard on the hip. When I put out my hand a second later, I found the light switch. Shaken, I decided to get dressed. I wanted to go out into the garden and watch the security men's maneuvers. I stopped at the door of the hall leading into the chilly garden to find the key that fitted the lock. While I had hold of the heavy door, a hand was laid on my shoulder.
I must ask you to go up to your room,
said the security man. I stepped back from the door, which swung closed. No one can prevent my being in the hall, I said.
I only have orders to forbid you from going into the gardens, he said.
Me? I said.
Anyone who goes near the main door, he said.
Ah, you're thinking about the shooting, I said. He raised his hand as if he wanted to reply. Then he turned round rapidly and left. At the breakfast table a rumor spread without causing the usual excitement. No one had sufficient concentration to take it seriously, though only a few days before it would have aroused noisy comment. 2 male guests had forced their way into the room occupied by the girl who had put the bowl of fruit in the washroom. They had laid down on her bed, but she screamed and pushed one of them against the radiator, hurting him in the process. The management had put the 2 men on trial, but they had been drunk on spirits or nerve tonic, and had defended themselves by saying that earlier the girl had invited one of the security men into her room. The management gave them a caution and promised to keep their names secret. The doctor gave the girl a tranquilizing injection, and for the time being she was excused from her duties. The story spread from table to table, and was greeted with smiles or shaking of the head. The former curiosity had gone, and the common indignation had faded away. I see Termush as a large organism, a single body, which acts according to different laws from those which apply to each individual guest. No one can foresee a reaction. The organism comes up with its reply later on, positive or negative. Or it reacts unexpectedly, as in paralysis. It rests and is tolerant, and then kicks out like a damaged muscle. But I must ask myself whether I am not coloring what I see with my own views, whether in my zeal and anxiety I make the general reaction distorted and fearful. Whether I too am to blame for the fact that Termush is shut in on itself, because I think I am making a significant contribution by talking to the doctor or running out into the garden to listen for pistol shots. My criticisms are turned inwards towards myself. My own desire for written notes tells me that I want to formulate my questions and doubts, but that I have already given up hope of answering them. The 12 guests who had been in isolation were let out of the shelters in the afternoon. The doctor had recommended a longer period of quarantine, but psychological reactions were weighed against physical ones. 5 days in the shelters had changed the 12 in confinement to pale, frightened figures. We remind them of their quarantine every moment with our sun-tanned faces and easy movements of arms and legs. The 12 guests sit together in the lounge or walk together in the gardens, as if after their exile they were condemned to keep together. Disaster has already left its mark on them in our eyes. Somewhere in their bodies lies the germ of change, of mutilation and decay. And somewhere within the healthy people lies a far-reaching contempt for the deformed. One picture in our minds gives us constant anxiety. We see the day when the fish leave the water and push through the sand and earth to the trees, where they bite into the bark with their skinless jaws and drag themselves up into the branches to live according to new instincts. We see the trees bare of leaves, festooned with fishy skeletons, their skins rustling like a death rattle. We see the turtle lay eggs and burrow into the earth, where it dies of thirst. Birds fall out of their nests without using their wings. The foal licks stones while the mare's udder is bursting with milk. The goat flays its kid and tries to chew its flesh. The bee turns its sting on itself. The corn starts to grow downwards, and the roots of the trees rise up to search for water from the air. And we see a market square or a great room full of human beings, lying or crawling or sitting. Some of them are without hair, their faces are bloated and mad, and they are unable to stand up. But among these feeble-minded ones sits the one man of genius. His head is swollen up, his gaze is steady, but his face is distorted with pain. All his strength has become concentrated in his brain, and his legs are unable to support him. Only by dragging himself over the bodies of the imbeciles, as they have to drag themselves over him, can he reach the spring of fresh water that runs near by. Our fear is no longer a fear of death, but of change and mutilation. We have not thought this through, and cannot talk about it, but in those moments when we are able to escape from our own personal needs, the picture becomes clear to us. It is impossible to sustain this thought. We cut it down, we put a ring round it in order to forget it, and we single out the 12 guests as evidence of our fear, which we have not the strength to bear. Maria came up to my room while the 12 guests crept round the park. Chapter 25. Early in the morning, a group of strangers broke into the gardens. At the hotel, everything was quiet. Only at the edge of the grounds, one of the watchmen was struck down.
The lawns stretch from the rough, churned-up land right up to the hotel building, with no obstacle of any kind. The strangers had no trouble in reaching the hall. When they were carrying their injured into the sick bay, they were met by 3 security men with automatic pistols. The strangers gave up their weapons, but refused to be detained. When the doctor arrived, the security men were standing there pointing aimlessly with their automatics. One of them kicked open the door and ran out into the garden, where he began to shoot up into the air or among the trees. The doctor went into the sick bay to give first aid to the injured. Many of the guests had assembled on the stairs. The tense, prolonged silence was broken by a group on the bottom landing. As if moved by a common impulse, they began to shout and go down to the bottom step and across the floor of the hall towards the strangers. They were stopped by the security men's automatic pistols. They jerked back, protesting, and their last shout rose up from the stairs. In the moment of silence, we could hear the injured moaning feebly from the sick bay. One of the management staff asked the guests to go back to their rooms. Gradually, the hall emptied of spectators. Disturbed and tired, we went up the stairs to split up along the various corridors. For a moment it seemed as if all possibilities were open. No one could avoid the crisis by a straightforward rejection. But the barriers glided together again like twin halves of a sphere. I wonder, could that be a sphere? A demon core, so to speak? Possibly in the Fat Man? Nice allegory. But the barriers glided together again like twin halves of a sphere. Bewilderment and doubt disappeared. Everyone knew his own mind. This happened without votes or meetings, as if after a common revelation. We cannot keep out the intruders in the morning, but preparing to meet them has become the final duty of our defense. The security men have been held in readiness for 24 hours around the walls of the garden and the building. They have orders to shoot at anyone who crosses the boundary of the estate. I cannot analyze the new strength, which among the guests takes the form of energy and excitement. Explanations float past me as if I were sunk deep in water. In the lounge, the management gave full particulars of the system of guard duty. They familiarized the guests with every explicit detail. Everything in Termush has begun to grow inwards. The last member of the management I have never seen before. His weariness and his long exploratory pauses make me think that he is the voice of the hotel's loudspeaker, but perhaps I am attaching too much importance to a chance similarity. He told us about the crowd of strangers who are wandering about in the countryside around Termush. Stricken people from the nearest towns or the more distant cities, remnants of larger groups, most of whom have succumbed to injuries or the big epidemics. The strongest have banded together to search for medicine and food, or towns where all of the inhabitants are dead and the stores are untouched. On the way, many of them have heard about Termush. No one moved when he finished speaking. The management itself broke the stillness by calling him down and giving orders for the doors to be opened. 9 security men entered in their shining suits, with their protective jackets and automatic pistols. They looked straight ahead and walked remarkably lightly in their heavy boots up to the management's table. There they formed a line with the traditional movements of body and weapon, all with their faces towards us. The management turned in their chairs, and I saw that they smiled, perhaps relieved, perhaps proud. Immediately after the end of the meeting, the first party of security men started on their duties. From the dining room and the hall, and from the windows in the bedrooms and the corridors, we could follow the movements of the white-clad figures. An inner cordon was set up by the building, and an outer one on the edge of the estate. They kept to their allotted stations, while the more vigilant and healthy among the guests patrolled the garden and the entrance to the drive with their eyes.
You could pick out the soldiers long after their silhouettes had been blurred by the trees and bushes. Exhausted as I am, I know that from this moment we have barred the way back. All the paths and passages and corridors have become cul-de-sacs. There is no through road. They lead only inwards. Nothing more can happen. In the silence I hear the faint call that the soldiers on the watch use to keep the men on the qui-vive. Or is it a special code for passing on reports and orders to one another? Chapter 26. The night was dark, crowded, punctured by sudden shots from the guards. I slept without dreaming, lay without turning over, my calf and shoulder muscles taut. Darkness filled the room in the same moment that sleep overpowered me. I spoke to Maria and offered the management the use of my room to accommodate the injured. I could easily move in with Maria. It would be no appreciable inconvenience for me, and she is willing to have me. The management rejected my offer immediately. I was annoyed, and may have said too much. Maria thought after I had told her what happened that I had said too much. Several of the guests witnessed my argument with the management, though that was not my intention. I left the office in a state of agitation, without shutting the door. I felt a powerful physical spasm. There have been shots several times today. No one knows whether they were all warning shots. The management, who mix with the guests the whole time, say that the sight of the reinforced guard has driven the strangers away. One of the guard came in from the garden with an injured arm. The accident was blamed on his carelessness with a hand grenade. He was supported by two other men, but not only his head was bandaged, his face too was hidden when he was carried into the sick bay. We gathered in the hall in aimless groups, impelled to come together and then separate, while the management went round talking to us. No important incident has happened, and the prevailing atmosphere is as if all the reports from the grounds had been details of a victory. Apart from the white-clad guards, the gardens have been empty, but everyone is looking expectantly in that direction. I sit at the table. Maria is lying on my bed. We are both silent. In the hall and the lounge, I felt that the other guests knew about my offer to the management. Their attitude did not suggest clearly disapproval or irritation, but I sensed their light contempt for my efforts. I went up to my room immediately after the evening meal. From here, too, I can hear movements in the corridors and in the hall. In the grounds there was a sudden shot, but I heard no shout. Without conscious thought, I summed up the room with my eyes. The mirror, the two shining pictures, the bed, the window, the door that is closed. I let my eyes wander from object to object. Maria has fallen asleep with her face turned aside. Chapter 27. Two of the security men have been killed by the strangers. The morning passed calmly. The guard was changed at midday. Shortly afterwards our adversaries opened fire from several hidden positions in the surrounding country. The two security men were carried into the hall. The face of one was unrecognizable. I think from his figure that it was he who warned Maria about the bird. The dead were covered with sheets. The guests passed by the plank bed, where the outlines of the bodies could be seen through the material. Their protective clothing had already been removed to be cleansed. We stayed in the hall or the lounge, where the management kept giving us new details. They took care to emphasize the number of dead among the strangers. In the grounds, the guards moved more rapidly, with greater energy or anger. From the window we followed them perseveringly, as if they needed our willpower in order to act freely. After a few hours, the stranger's attack ceased. Chapter 28. We are staying in the shelters. There was a new attack on the guard this morning. Volunteers among the guests have begun to offer to take up the leftover weapons and protective suits. Maria does not reply when I speak to her. She stares at me, wounded. She keeps close to me, follows me almost stride for stride, as if this were an order. She frightens me. She is sitting by my side, leaning against the wall, asleep. There has been talk of possibilities of flight. Some talk about hostages, or the burning up of the estate, or the destruction of Termush above ground. The strangers have stopped shooting. On the cliffs nearby, their campfires are visible in the darkness. The guards who report this are quite exhausted. We are allowed to leave the shelters, but the majority of us choose to spend the night here. My skin burns in my hands. Chapter 29. We have decided to leave Termush. The first killed and wounded among the volunteers have been brought back to the hotel. Early in the morning, a motor yacht is sailing from Termush. We have already started bringing down the provisions and the drinking water. The transport section is camouflaged and is being covered by the guards. While this activity is going on, soldiers are reinforcing our defenses at the boundaries of the estate. Everywhere among the rocks and in the flat, wooded countryside, our enemy can be found. The guards have marked his positions and his movements on a map. The doctor says he will stay at Termush. The deputy medical officer is coming on the motor yacht. The doctor's intention is to help the strangers, among whom there are certain to be many injured. Neither the management nor the guests have raised any objections to his decision. I feel as if all the time I were waiting for Maria. She follows me everywhere, stops a little way behind me, and gazes at me until I move on. She is remote and watchful. I look at her to see in what way she has changed. I see her eyes, which are clear and open. She understands what I say to her, but she does not answer. Even when I meet her gaze, it feels as if she had mentally turned her back on anyone who looks at her. I take her hand and feel her skin. I hold her close to me, and she smiles. But it has no effect on her. So I go on walking, and she follows calmly behind me, and if the other guests speak to her, she does not look at them. When she is cold, she stops me and points to my jacket. Chapter 30. In the morning, when it was light, the enemy attacked. The guard was reinforced at the farthest boundaries of the estate, but a smaller group thrust in up the drive. There was a moment's confusion while conflicting orders were given to our soldiers. The attack was beaten off. The alarm on the hotel roof called us out of our rooms. With no time to bring anything with us but our most essential possessions, we moved in small groups through the gardens to the motor yacht. The guards protected us. Apart from some superficial wounds from the shooting, the hotel guests came aboard unscathed. The guards withdrew through the gardens. It happened so suddenly that the enemy did not understand their intention. Our soldiers reached the boat before the strangers broke in through the perimeter of the grounds. As we sailed away, we saw that the gardens were full of people. We lay close together on the floor and the benches to protect ourselves against gunfire from the park. But no shots were fired after us. Halfway down the slope, the great stone figures gleamed in the sun. All is quiet in the ship's lounge. The land has disappeared. The sun is strong and warm. Everywhere heads drop down. Bodies are too tired to support them. Maria rests against me. Chapter 31. No one wakes up refreshed. Coffee and rolls are brought round. The heat is powerful, although we froze during the night. They are having trouble with the engine. We move to go up on deck or out to the lavatory. The boat rolls gently. There is no wind. We are half lying in our seats, many with eyes half closed against the sun. No one moves about more than is necessary. Outside the sea is still. There is no darkness and no light. And that was Termush, a novel by Sven Holm, translated by Sylvia Clayton. So how about that? Largely speaks for itself, I think. Some fascinating language choices used. This really bizarre transitioning from describing events to doing metaphor slash allegory um, in a very dreamlike way that you can tell probably informed a lot of Jeff Vandermeer's narrative decisions and writing style. I would compare them favorably. Um, he's taking good ideas from Sven Holm, if that's where he was taking it from. Certainly, they came to some similar off-putting means of describing things. Here I have author credits. Sven Holm, who lived from 1940 to 2019, was a celebrated Danish novelist, short story writer, and playwright. He was awarded the Grand Prize of the Danish Academy in 1974, followed by the Holberg Medal in 1991. He won the Danish Critics' Prize for Literature in 2001 and was made a member of the Danish Academy that same year. And Sylvia Clayton, the translator, who lived from 1926 to 1994, was a novelist, journalist, and translator. Her novel Friends and Romans won the 1975 Guardian Fiction Prize. Her other novels include The Crystal Gazers, The Peninsula, Top Sea, and Sabbatical. And I guess I will do the foreword by Jeff Vandermeer, since Kiri asked so nicely. Also because I have spare time, and why not? Foreword by Jeff Vandermeer. Outside the sea is still, there is no darkness and no light. See what I mean by spoilers? That's literally the last line of the book. It's literally the last line of the book. And he's like, let's open with that. Halfway through Sven Holm's taut, unfolding nightmare, Termush, the unnamed narrator encounters plowed up and trampled gardens, where stone creatures are the sole survivors. Holm describes these statues as curious forms, the bodies like great ill-defined blocks, designed more to evoke a sense of weight and mass than to suggest power in the muscles and sinews. Later, a guest of this gated, walled hotel for the rich relates a dream in which light streamed out of every object. It shone through robes and skin and the flesh on the bones, the leaves on the trees, to reveal the innermost vulnerable marrow of people and plants. The same could describe an enduring quality of Termush itself, which accrues its strange effects via both this stricken, continuous revealing and the curious forms of a solid, impervious setting, in which the ordinary elements of our world come to seem alien through the lens of nuclear catastrophe. Long before the sanctuary of Termush becomes visibly unsafe, these tears at the fringes of reality signify the truth of the narrator's situation. The very texture of the world becomes unknowable, or, alternatively, imbued with a potency, vibration, or sheen that alters reality. Holmes' Termush, then, is both a realistic chronicle of a micro-society's collapse and a surreal journey of a man confronted by crisis, remaking his surroundings as a way of coping. Another overlap exists here, too, one not as pronounced as in the 1960s when Holm published Termush. The detritus and decisions of the past may still affect our future, in that the threat of nuclear holocaust has not left us. But in the interim, other disasters that manifest in largely invisible, in quotes, ways have overtaken us. Our fear of radiation and immolation has led to climate crisis fear, which has led to pandemic fear. The grappling of minds with these threats leads to derangement and odd visions, because the elements of infiltration and contamination baffle the brain. Our hauntings in the modern era so often now are not ghosts, but simply the things we cannot see, but that radically affect us. Little wonder, then, that, read now, the lucid logic of Termush feels more like lucid dreaming, imbued with a new relevance in which unseen monsters creep through the same rooms as the narrator, studying his movements. The stark deficiencies of emergency management become hyper-real or ultra-real because of the overlay of self-inflictions in our modern times. For Termush, unlike some vintage classics, cult or otherwise, has waxed, not waned, in relevance. The accuracy in the calm description of becoming undone by disaster, and the anonymity of place and character, ensures a sense of timelessness. It's a curious book in this regard, with its dispassionate prose that eschews, in large part, the sensory detail of taste, touch, and smell, yet gets to the heart of living through such a situation. At that heart is the disconnection that occurs, laid bare by a certain level of detail, or lack of detail. Amid the banal recitation of procedure and the understated but sharp satire about privileged people, such a strong sense of feeling about the world rises from these pages. Holm cleverly has his narrator both draw attention away from and underscore this impulse from the opening pages, in which he expresses confusion about how painlessly catastrophe has come to pass, having unconsciously thought in terms of something more drastic, a radical transformation, with every object showing traces of what had occurred, the furniture and the walls changing character, and the view outside our window revealing a totally different world. In this way, the physical manifestations of human imagination become characters in the novella, even when unchanged, because they are expected to change. One of the best passages in Termush builds on this impulse in an extended disaster reverie, which expresses confusion, relief, and a restructuring of the narrator's surroundings to match the invisible truth. That stone would no longer be stone, and air no longer air, so that to find a person turned into a pillar of salt would no longer be a myth, but a reality. This transmutation reflects a yearning for comfort, for anchors, for meaning, that the radiation either eludes or of which it was always preternaturally free. How much better, the subtext screams, if it were all made manifest so I could understand it better, grapple with it, wrestle it to the ground. But no, it is not even mist. Mist to wander through lost, perhaps charting a course offshore in the hotel yacht, which at one point is guest engorged and sent out to sea to distract from the calamity. Are you in favor of the management's boat trip? I am in favor of the management's boat trip. Thus goes a trippy chapter with an existential undertow. Holm can also be funny in his deadpan recital of the procedures of emergency. A highly honored literary realist in Denmark, Holm may not have expected to, or even intended to create a speculative novella that reads so well to a modern audience. His other works contain no such element, but many do feature similar grand gestures, and all critique modern society, seeking ways to, for lack of a better term, wake the reader up to the evils of capitalism and other consumptive ideologies. In its treatment of the aftermath of nuclear war, Termush distinguishes itself from the so-called disaster cozies of the 1950s, like the novels of John Wyndham, to occupy more urgent territory. In this genre, the dangers of some calamitous situation become entwined with an almost cheery disaster tourism tone. But more importantly, civilization always wins in the end, even if in an altered form. The militias may hold sway for a while, or the plague lay waste to whole towns, but by the novel's close, equilibrium and balance, logic and order, always return to human endeavors. Not so much in Termush, which also eludes, through its particular focus and narrative velocity, echoes of Cold War conflict which might otherwise have dated the novella. Instead of a pervading sense of the other about to storm the gates, Holm delves into the psychology of the holed-up survivors and the hazards of societal breakdown. In this sense, and with its surreal touches, Termush feels more like a bridge novella between the return to normalcy of the cozy and the extravagant, mind-bending dystopias of J.G. Ballard, which ushered in the modern era of this kind of fiction. The right excerpt from Termush could easily have appeared in New Worlds, the seminal 1960s magazine for the new wave of which Ballard was a part. This speculative movement ably applied a rigorous intellectual attitude and sometimes formally experimental approaches to hybrid novels. Novels that had a gritty, realistic feel while at the same time trading in unsettling images and devastating portrayals of the psychological effects of the wrong future on human minds. Holm definitely meant to access the psychological reality of his situation, and the novella contains much subtle character insight, despite his characters often existing at the same sparse level of detail as their surroundings. The hotel doctor, for example, asks a woman for a urine sample to check the guest's health, but she collapses across the table in a fit of hysteria while she repeated that nothing was wrong with her urine. In a lesser novel, this would function for the modern reader as a gendered signpost of the times. But Holm proves more insightful, with his narrator's observation that the woman's reaction is understandable. What is less understandable is the way the rest of us keep such an inflexibly stiff upper lip without relaxing in argument or giving way to laughter or irritation. Her outburst seems to me more natural because it means that neither her imagination nor her sensibility is gagged and bound, as ours are. Holmes shows that in trying to cope by stifling such impulses, the very landscape becomes distorted and unfamiliar, while the invisible malady continues to infiltrate and surround the hotel. Few dystopian novels focused on a privileged group's reaction to disaster lack some societal critique, and if Termush's commentary seems basic, well, perhaps the modern monoculture needs to become more complex. As ever, from before Termush, during Termush, and after Termush, rich people tend to be more able to escape the effects of an event, for the obvious reasons. Yet Holmes' portrayal of dealing with radiation refugees storming the hotel has a logic and humanity that is deeply thought-provoking, as the hotel management tries to act ethically, with some guests agreeing to support them and some not. His deft touch inhabits sentences like, "The groaning of the sick people in the library has died down," as if they too were issued with brandy, or had been asked not to disturb the festivities on the hotel's anniversary. Late in the novella, too, as conditions worsen but also deepen, the narrator's imagination widens to contemplate the entirety of what cannot be seen and what has not yet been fully felt within their privileged sanctuary. We see the day when the fish leave the water and push through the sand and earth to the trees, where they bite into the bark with their skinless jaws and drag themselves up into the branches to live according to new instincts. We see the trees bare of leaves, festooned with fishy skeletons, their skins rustling like a death rattle. From this phantasmagorical beginning, the narrator's vision spreads outward to encompass the earth and the humans within it. While Termush admirably conveys the reality of living through nuclear apocalypse, Holmes' greatest triumph lies in conveying the psychological strangeness and derangement of such a situation. If the novella can be termed a kind of classic, it is for these unexpected and unique elements, which are, in a sense, more real than reality. Our fear is no longer a fear of death, but of change and mutation, Holm writes. Onward onward to Termush. Perhaps, one way or another, we can make it there in time. So yeah, that's the foreword written by Jeff Vandermeer. Um, but yeah, hopefully people enjoyed. I hadn't even heard of the book until maybe a year or two ago. I didn't even know it existed, even though it's been in print for half a century or more, which really shames me greatly. But it's fine. You can't know everything, and that's okay. Um, yeah, my edition is from 2023, so it probably wasn't until a year or so ago. Um, and it blew me away. I was like, oh my goodness, I like this for all the reasons I like Jeff Vandermeer, and then some. And then I'm like, wait a minute, this was written in the 60s? Huh? So very, very pleased with that one. Hope people enjoyed. I know I certainly did. Um, Next week and the week after, I will not be here. But I will be here for this Friday when we will finish Destination Void by Frank Herbert. When I get back in 2 weeks, I will start. We will still be reading through Armor by John Stakely. We're about halfway through it right now, I think. Um, Wednesdays, I don't know what I'll be doing for that. And on Fridays, we will start reading through The Three Body Problem by Cixin Liu, the first novel in the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, I think is what they call the trilogy now. Or always have, and I just keep forgetting that that's what it's called. Anyway, that's the plan. What I may wind up doing is using Wednesdays to help plow through the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 books that I have queued up for Fridays because there's no way we're getting it done in a year otherwise. Um, it'll be done sometime next year. Like, there's just no way. I'm good, I'm not that good. And some of these are very long. I just got done a read through of At Death's End, the final volume of the Three Body Problem trilogy. And that book's very long. It's not as long as say Hyperion was, but it's long. So and the middle book is also quite long, and the first book is also quite long. So you see where I'm going with this. Interestingly, the Pandora sequence by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom, each individual book isn't quite as long, but it does have the Destination Void as sort of prequel slash preface, which doesn't really set the tone for the series, but it sets up kind of a basic initial explanation of how the status quo in the Jesus incident, the first book of the trilogy, shows up. So yes, indeed, we are making headway on our literary endeavors. Um, with that, I guess I'll skip away. See you all Friday, hopefully, and yeah, hope people enjoyed. I will get the this Friday. I will get the after I finish streaming Destination Void. I will get the what are they called? Playlists updated, which means I'm going to have to create a couple. So there will be a few of those, so people can listen through stuff at their leisure. If you want to tune in to me live, otherwise, I read except for the next 2 weeks, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, starting at 12 noon U.S. East Coast time, which is UTC -5. Which I realize is not a particularly convenient time for really anyone, but it is the convenient time for me, and that's when it gets done. That's why they're all recorded and available on my YouTube channel. Yep, that's it. So yeah, thanks again to everyone who tuned in. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. See you all next time. Bye.